So little did y'all know that this is actually a comrade karaoke night. So I hope that you all brought your music. We've got our friends on decks up here. A lot of gratitude. Good evening, everyone, and a very rowdy welcome to Speculative Futures, Abolitionist Histories here at the Flamboyant Theater in the Clemente Soto Vélez Center. Want to just give a shout out to honor the Clemente Center for hosting us tonight. My name is Connor Tomas Reed. I also go by Coco, and welcome all pronouns. And I'm the program director of the Shape of Cities to Come Institute and the author of a recently published book called New York Liberation School. And okay. I want to thank the Clemente and Shape of Cities to Come comrades for co-coordinating tonight's event, and to each and every single one of you for converging here. I also want to share a special welcome to these 4 radiant participants in our first public dialogue for SCCI. So before we kind of come in tonight and I share a little bit about our participants, I want you all to take a moment and look at who else is gathered here in the room. So look around, maybe hold each other's gaze for a moment. So all of us have chosen to come here tonight. All of us have chosen to reach out towards each other this evening on the theme of speculative futures and abolitionist histories. And when we come together and reach out across our shared lineages, this is the soil from which new relationships, new cities, new societies can emerge. And so really want to honor that you all are gathered here tonight to be able to think and dream big with each other. So the shape of cities to come. So this is not a predetermined horizon. New York City in particular stands at a kind of crossroads of vicious inequities or compassionate social reinvention. And SCCI, which is a new initiative, is shaped by a team and inaugural cohort of 18 changemakers, and is proposing a vision that's not too modest and not too humble for the city to become a freedom school, for the city to become a cultural engine, a mutual aid epicenter, and much, much more. We have a 15-month study, play, act movement incubator that's working to enhance and entwine the skills and actions of participants, and we're holding public dialogues like these to spark new urban strategies together. So we're aiming to bridge a lot of issues across the 5 boroughs, across our various kinds of movement work and arts and culture. And SCCI is really thrilled to study, play, and act with New York City's movement ecosystem, and that includes all of you. So want to invite you tonight to redesign and to recreate our city in conversations like these, this beloved city, in order to be able to meet everyone's needs from the bottom to the top. So drawing on past, present, and even 30 to 50 years into the future, models of liberation, our 4 speakers tonight are going to be envisioning alternative possibilities for New York City. And we'll first get to hear from Eman Abdelhadi and M.E. O'Brien, then from Rosa Daniel Lang-Levitsky and Van Shelo, who will all then engage in a dialogue together, and this will be followed by time, ample time for general conversation, questions, reflections from you all. So how does that sound? Are y'all still with me? Okay. If we play our cards right, we may get into some karaoke. We'll see what happens. So let's first get to hear who's up here. Eman Abdelhadi, they or she pronouns, is an academic, activist, and writer who thinks at the intersection of gender, sexuality, religion, and politics. She's an assistant professor and sociologist at the University of Chicago, where she researches American Muslim communities. Eman is co-author of Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072, with M.E., published in 2022 with Common Notions Press. And Eman's academic work has been published in numerous sociology journals and covered by press outlets such as the Washington Post, Associated Press, and NPR. M.E. O'Brien, she, her pronouns, writes and speaks on gender freedom and capitalism. She has written 2 books, Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communizing of Care, out with Pluto Press, 2023, and the co-authored speculative novel, Everything for Everyone, with Eman. She also co-edits 2 magazines, Pinko on gay communism, and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. M.E.'s work on family abolition has been translated into Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, Catalan, and Turkish, because this is very much a transnational question. Rosa Daniel Lang-Levitsky, they or she pronouns, is a cultural worker, organizer, and agitator based at Brooklyn's Glitter House. Rosa is just another diasporist, gender trife, diesel femme Mischling who identifies with, not as. Rosa is currently anchored in abolitionist feminist work with Survive and Punish New York, in anti-Zionist solidarity work with Yiddishistin, Meet Palestine, and in a potpourri of performance projects. And you can find out more at meansof.org. And last but certainly not least, Van Shalo, who uses she, her, they, them pronouns, is a born and raised New Yorker, passionate about social and environmental justice. Van's approach to radical and abolitionist work through a queer, decolonial, feminist perspective is a part of Van's work in Queer Detainee Empowerment Project. Van joined QDEP in February 2022 as an organizer to help build coalitions and partnerships with other groups, as well as strengthen and expand the membership base. Van is in the New School's MS program in Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management, and received their BA in Urban Studies with a minor in Culture in Media there. So without further ado, please join me in giving a raucous welcome to these four speakers.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much to Coco and this new initiative and everyone whose work makes this event possible. Me and Eman have been asked to talk for 10 minutes or so right now to introduce some of the basics of the book that we wrote together. It's quite loud. Everything for Everyone is a novel. It's set in the future. It's a collection of fictional oral histories with fictional people about their experiences in a future global communist revolution and when it reaches New York City. And the form of the novel is we each are interviewers. We are oral historians playing ourselves as very old ladies in like 2072. Going around being like, who do we want to interview about the revolution? What do they have to say about what happened? And because it's New York, people come from all over the world and they bring many, many different experiences. And many of the stories are embedded in very specific geographies in New York, very particular neighborhoods and histories that where the revolution unfolds in an uneven and dynamic way. And many of the characters wrestle with trauma. The world gets very, very bad in the 2040s, even worse than it is now. And many of the characters are kind of on various sorts of healing journeys. So that's the beginning, and we'll go back and forth for a little bit.
So a lot of folks always wonder how we came to write this book. Neither of us is a fiction writer. We're both sci-fi fans. I'm kind of the sidekick sci-fi fan, and that when Michelle and I started hanging out about a decade ago, Michelle discovered that I was woefully underread in sci-fi, even though I read a lot of fiction. And so started recommending books systematically to me, and I started reading them, devouring them really. And so this book was really a labor of love for both of us, and born out of a decade-long friendship and comradeship, and a sort of belief that sci-fi lends us the ability to think about the sort of historical material changes of the world, right? That we can basically use this form to effectively theorize the future, to theorize the present, in fact, by thinking about where the present is leading us, right? How that might fall apart, and what would happen if history opened up enough for alternative possibilities to manifest themselves. So in the book, we think a lot about social change. We think a lot about the kind of macro structural change of the revolution, right? So what does the fall of the nation state look like? What does the fall of markets look like? What does the fall of commodity exchange through like money look like? But also, what does the fall of institutions like the family look like? And how is everyone on a both personal and social level transformed by these broader social transformations, and how do they in turn transform them through their actions and their interventions?
Tell us about Kaka Hassan.
We also liberate Palestine. So that's like in chapter 2. Andy Battle is in the audience. I always like to call Andy. Andy's our amazing editor that we worked with at Common Notions. And when we, this was the first chapter I wrote. It was the first chapter I proposed. Was a chapter with a character who grows up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and then in her late teens, moves to Palestine right before liberation. And she, and so she recounts these events through our interview. And then I wrote that chapter and then disappeared for a couple months. I was like, I'm done, right? I did the thing. I'm Palestinian, wrote the liberation. I'm good. But then, had to show up to write the rest of the book.
So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from one of the chapters that Eman wrote. Eman asks this character, Lateef Timbers, who is talking about being an orphan with a gang of other kids living in Prospect Park as New York is collapsing. And then they get invited into joining a commune, which are the basic social institutions that everyone lives in. And Eman asks, did you get to choose who to live with? Lateef Timbers says, yeah, pretty much. They said, listen, we can divide you up to live with adults, or you can live as a group, the group of children that were living together, but have an adult check on you every so often. It kind of tied to how people were thinking about their living situations too, like the adults themselves. Reading more and more about how people lived before, I've been realizing that family was usually blood, and that's who you lived with. And who you lived with was really tied into what you got. So like, if your blood had food, you had food. If they had a nice home and heat, you did too. If they didn't, well, tough shit for you, you were fucked. And Abdelhadi laughs and says, yeah, I'm old enough to confirm that's how we lived for a long time. Talking to elders and reading history, I realize, this is Lateef, I realize people are really trying to get rid of that system with the communes. Honestly, it's hard to imagine making all your choices based on blood. Why would it matter so fucking much who gave birth to you? Or who you fell in love with, or who happened to have the same parent? Like, what if those people were straight up assholes? Or just didn't know how to take care of you? And people only had 2 parents? Who were expected to take care of everything? So inefficient. Like, wouldn't you collectivize things like childcare? It makes no goddamn sense. It's hard to know how anyone could focus on the love part of things when there was so much else involved. So that connects in with the other nonfiction book I wrote, Family Abolition. I think Eman's chapters do a magnificent job sort of exploring the limits and overcoming in this speculative register of what moving beyond the family form might mean. I think the last thing I'll add is I mentioned their neighborhoods. It reflects a lot of, it draws very heavily on the history of organizing in New York City, on thinking about current and historical struggles. You know, there's a hospital takeover in a way that's reminiscent of the Young Lords and Black Panthers doing a hospital takeover. The first chapter is about a sex worker in Hunts Point in the Bronx when they take over the food market in the middle of an extended famine and use it to feed the city. and I moved to New York City to work at a syringe exchange program in Hunts Point, and I'm trans, and I spent a lot of time doing outreach to trans sex workers in the neighborhood, and really learned a tremendous amount from their political leadership. And you know, there's at one point they send catapults of burning oil drums over the military barricade. And I think after we wrote that, there was a strike of Hunts Point workers where they had burning oil cans that they were gathered around, because you know it opens up at like 1 a.m. so they were on the picket line in the middle of the night. And so there's many, many things like that sort of woven through the whole book, sort of references to our personal lives, references to actual struggles happening in New York City, references to like historical movements that we have learned a lot from.
And I will add to that very important point that universities and the role of university students, as you know, there's a chapter that with a hospital takeover, but the interviewee is also a student activist and particularly a CUNY student in the book, and so that's sort of our nod to the immense radical history of student organizing in this city. I think especially at a moment where that organizing is being targeted at unprecedented levels and repressed, we need to really acknowledge, you know, how the role that students play in social movements, and the role that universities can play as at least a site for radical formations, even when the administrators are not so keen, to put it very lightly.
Is that 10 minutes?
Hey all. One moment for logistics. I think for the slides, maybe just slowly cycle through them so that the images will be there and I won't have to think about that much. So I'm half of the team that's put together a 4-zine series, each one coupled with an event. There are 2 that have happened and 2 still to come, called City of Abolished Prisons. My collaborator on this, Annabelle Heckler, who's a comics artist and labor movement activist and researcher for many, many years, wasn't able to be here tonight. So you're getting me and Ben, who's one of the stalwarts at QDAP, which is one of the organizations that we've worked with on the events for the zine series. So basically, the series came out of my realization that, and I am giving myself a timer because I have no sense. Realization that it's not just the former Women's House of Detention that Hugh Ryan has written so wonderfully about in Greenwich Village, and it's not just the former so-called Crow Hill Penitentiary or Brooklyn Penitentiary in my neighborhood, Crown Heights, which I happen to know about just from living in the neighborhood for almost 20 years. But there are well over a dozen places in our city that used to be prisons or jails and aren't anymore. And that history is basically invisible as we walk around. There's a very few of these sites that have any kind of marker. But the fact that we live around these transformed sites is something that, to me, can give us hope for actual abolition. Because we call this City of Abolished Prisons, it's obviously an overstatement. Almost none of these cages were torn down through any kind of liberatory organizing. There's a few that were. Those aren't the ones in Brooklyn that this first series has been talking about. They've been, these prisons and jails have ended because of various kinds of reform program, which as we know are part of prison preservation, or because of various kinds of land grab, or because they were not doing the job that the state wants them to do particularly well. But they are nonetheless places that, to talk about the four that these scenes are about, that were a massive prison and prison factory in what's in the land that's now Medgar Evers College in Crown Heights. They were a set of different jail facilities on the land that's now the Brooklyn Hospital Center in Fort Greene. They were the prison ship, the Bibby Venture, docked at Brooklyn Army Terminal in Sunset Park, where now there are community organizations envisioning a waterfront that is still a working waterfront, but that is one that is oriented towards sustainability and towards the sustenance of the community of Sunset Park. And they were prison ships in Wallabo Bay that are the reason that there is a monument at the top of Fort Greene Park. In a lot of ways, the stories of these sites connect out in all kinds of ways to ongoing struggles, to past struggles. Among other things in particular, there's really direct ways that they make the connection between incarceration and militarism. The hulks that were in Wallabo Bay were the British prison ships for prisoners of war during the US War of Independence. It's not surprising that those are some of the only prisoners whose deaths are memorialized in the city. The hulks, those prison ships, were the greatest site of death in that war, more than any battlefield. And similarly, the prison ship, the Bibby Venture, that docked in Sunset Park, had a previous life as a troop carrier for the British government during the Malvinas War. It's one of its later efforts at being a worldwide colonial power in the early 1980s. And the last two very short things that I'll say is that our fourth scene, because we were completing it this past month, is an attempt to make the connection between the carceral history underneath Brooklyn Hospital Center and the ongoing destruction of hospitals and healthcare infrastructure within the carceral structure of the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the rest of Palestine. So it's also a solidarity gesture towards the liberation of Palestine, which is part of the work that we've been trying to do with the project of building these connections of solidarity, and through the ways that the carceral tentacles reach out in all kinds of directions. And Queer Detainee Empowerment Project has been a major part of the abolitionist work against that, which,
yeah, thank you for that. All right, awesome. So I'm Van. I'm a community organizer with QDA. So as Rosa mentioned, QDA is an abolitionist organization that's working towards the liberation of LGBTQIA+, HIV positive immigrants and asylum seekers. So we work on a number of campaigns and coalitions to work towards our mission statement. We do it through community organizing and member support, but I'll be speaking a bit more about our community organizing actions. I will go more in depth about our campaigns and coalitions later on, because I see that's one of our questions for later. But I did want to talk about our leadership development program which is focused on working with trans women, queer cis women, and gender nonconforming immigrants. We recognize that these were individuals who were often a bit more targeted in the detention centers, and so we wanted to empower them a bit more. And through this program, we're trying to foster our members to understand a bit more of the systemic oppressions that are placed against them and how to strategically address them. And it was one of our members, Samuel, that introduced us to Annabelle and Rosa, so it was kind of a great moment to see the work that we're doing is impacting and motivating our members to do some community organizing and engagement. I'm not too sure how much time I have left, so I'll just go a bit into our campaigns and coalitions. So we are also part of the Abolish New York, New Jersey coalition. And within that coalition, we are also part of the Dignity Not Detention Coalition, which is working towards passing a bill that would essentially cancel contracts between ICE and public prisons. So many folks tend to forget that a number of detention centers are just beds in public prisons. And so canceling this contract will essentially abolish public detention centers. And we are also part of the New York Immigration Coalition, which is also a national coalition. And through that coalition, we are part of the CARE Coalition, which is a two-parter campaign. It focuses on trying to increase the budgetary line for immigration, legal and social services. And it's also trying to pass the Access for Representation, which is a bill that would essentially give immigrants free legal counsel when appearing for court, a right that many residents in New York already have. And we are also part of the Detention Watch Network, which is a more federal level coalition. And through that, we are also partnering with the Defund Hate campaign, which is pushing for the Biden administration to reallocate funds to immigrant legal and social services. And that's just a bit of an overview of what we do in community organizing.
So the intention is for some dialogue tonight. You got to hear a little bit of initial framing on these different projects, these different initiatives, and really want to start by thinking about the imagination. So all too often, just to get a sense of here in the room, how many people who are gathered here tonight were more excited about the speculative futures part? And how many people were more excited about the abolitionist histories part? Or are y'all here for both? Okay, all right, okay, all right, so we're here for both. Still mustering up the energy. So thinking about the power of the imagination, all too often when there is a kind of alternative view of what the world could be like, including what New York City could be like, we get a lot of dystopian content, right? That things will actually be really shitty after the revolution, or that the ruling powers will continue to be the ruling powers and will make things more and more nefarious. And so a question I have is, thinking about the role of storytelling, thinking about the role of translation between experiences, how this is an initiative that can be thinking about new worlds that can be built. So wondering if there's a kind of invitation for Eman and ME to, in working on this book, Everything for Everyone, to invite people to tell different stories about struggles in the future. And thinking about with Rosa and Van, how bringing in these abolitionist histories and thinking about translating across people's experiences, both inside and outside of cages, what this can do in order to be able to invite new militant stories to be told.
One way of thinking about Everything for Everyone is it's an exercise in imagining what if all the struggles that we care about and are a part of actually won. And I think that would be a very powerful thing for everyone to do. The utopianism gets a bad rap, and for some good reasons. I think the historically utopian socialists were very confused about how social change happens. But I think what we lose out on in sort of never allowing ourselves to imagine beyond the pragmatic is not allowing ourselves to desire. And that desires, revolutionary horizons, emerge in people's desires whenever we organize. And they emerge as slogans and on signs and, suddenly during the George Floyd rebellion, everyone was talking about abolishing police, right? This like incredible revolutionary abolitionist communist future that like teenagers were arguing about on Instagram. And it was incredible, right? It was incredible. And that's what one of the things rebellions enable is allowing people to desire more expensively and desire differently and desire more deeply in a way that we don't typically do. And so, one response that we've gotten, not so much from like readers of the book, but from workshops, is people really disciplining their imaginations to solely what's pragmatic, to being like, no, that's not possible, wouldn't work. And they shut down their own thinking. And another response has been people like passionate about our book and really excited. And as Eman alluded to, we're not incredible literary, brilliant people. I mean, we're brilliant, but we don't write lots and lots of fiction. And so that response, the intensity of that response really spoke to me of how starved everyone is for being able to actually think about the world that we want to live in and allowing ourselves to talk about that with each other. And so in many ways, the book is definitely, people have called it a prophecy and a blueprint and a program. It's none of those things, but it is an invitation for everyone to imagine the world that we want to live in as a part of our day-to-day.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you end with that you just ended with the book as an invitation, which is definitely something I found so wonderful in it. But is also the way that me and Annabelle have been talking about our project, is saying, by looking at these past histories, we get to break the idea that the current present was inevitable. And that we've been talking about as an invitation to saying, okay, so the jail that used to be in my neighborhood is now a working class university campus, mostly serving Black New Yorkers. That's fucking awesome. And not only do we need to be able to imagine beyond universities as we currently know them, but we also need to be able to imagine that could be just as true on the place where they're trying to build the new borough-based jail near downtown Brooklyn, or on the land where the tombs now are, here in Lower Manhattan. Or for that matter, in the carceral institution that's currently sitting at Broadway and 110th Street, or 116th Street rather, which could use some radical transformation itself. The past is an invitation to imagine, if we let it be, and the erasure of the histories of change in the city are part of what makes that hard.
Hey, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, through the LDP program and also with our member meetings, which we have every Tuesday night, which is actually happening right now in our office, we have a series of political education workshops where we do examine past struggles and the histories of these movements, because many of our members are escaping their country of origin because of all the oppression and attacks that they're having because of whether it be their gender identity or their sexuality. And then just to come to the States to then realize there's other things that are oppressing them and there's other things that are stopping them from having this liberating life to whatever it means to them. And so it's hard for them to imagine what a world beyond these oppressive systems are like. And so when you were mentioning like some people just shut down when they're trying to envision this future, that's something that is I've seen repeatedly within our members. And so it's when through examining and seeing what has already occurred in the past gives them a sense of motivation and a sense of hope, and they start to radically imagine like what would the future be like, what would happen if we were to shut down this prison, which is something that we did with the event in Brooklyn. We were having a moment of reflecting, like what would we do, what would we build in replacement of this prison? And it's something that we tend to bring up in discussions with our political education workshops, through our LDP program. And it's incredible to see what they can imagine once they see that the possibility is there.
I'll add to this that I think that my colleagues here were talking so eloquently about the kind of social structures and imagining them changing. And I think one dimension I'd like to add to this is the dimension of what the living under this current system teaches us about ourselves, right? What it has us believing about ourselves and about each other. And I think, you know, one of the things that Emmy and I find ourselves doing a lot is, and perhaps because we're both academics in different ways, is showing up to college classrooms where our book has been assigned. That's been kind of a more recent development. And one of the things that makes me the saddest is to find folks that are 19, 20, 21, right, saying things like, well, everyone would just kill each other, right? Not like in terms of our book, but to like unable to imagine not being disciplined by the state, right? Unable to imagine, or you know, we had one student who said, well, what would incentivize people to do a good job, like at work? You know, like what basically this idea that you need to have your entire life energy dominated by capitalism in order to produce something, right? And I think for me, you know, a huge part of the book is also an invitation to reimagine ourselves, right? To say what we've been taught to believe about ourselves is not true, right? In fact, contradictory of our experiences in our lives, right? And what happens if we break that hold a little bit, right? To say like, actually the kind of liberal order that teaches you that everyone would just destroy each other in the absence of the state is wrong and is politically motivated, right? Or the idea that people can only, you know, contribute to society through vestiges of, you know, money and profit and all of these things. So that's, I think, another important dimension. And I think thinking about the ways that those ideological structures isolate us from each other and make us deeply miserable and sad. Yeah, and so it's an invitation to rethink those as well.
Right on. Thank y'all. So I want to share a little bit about Shape of Cities to Come Institute's process. We've been doing intensive study this fall, thinking about these three themes of urban contradictions, storytelling, and political ecologies or political economies of New York City. And one of the ways that we've been really deepening a focus on doing cultural work, doing organizing in New York City, is to just roll out the map and say, what is our city comprised of? Where are the institutions? Where are the different organizations that are doing powerful work? What are the fleeting campaigns that erupted in one area and then moved to another area but then dissipated? So really trying to figure out a dense and thick understanding of our city as a movement ecosystem. And a question I have is, so this book, Everything for Everyone, the City of Abolished Prisons, QDEF's work, very much so trying to think about the city as a terrain to be curious about and to be lovingly immersed in. And a question I have is, if you all have some maybe ideas for organizers in the room about the places in our city that are maybe there's too much attention that movements give to, or places in our city where they're often overlooked as sources of power. And thinking about a little bit more strategically where we could, as different movements, dedicate more attention to strategically disrupting some things, or doing more community empowerment and mutual aid work, thinking about where in the city we can look for those kinds of power.
I will say just off the top of my head, in terms, thinking about the current moment and perhaps this is sort of tangential to your question, but one thing I've been thinking a lot about is the ways that participating in the movements of the last 10 years, and particularly the movement for Black Lives, has shifted the current organizing for Palestine. So thinking about all the ways that we are in a totally different, I'm someone who, I went to my first Palestine protest probably at the age of 10. And, thinking about the ways that this is such a different movement now because of all the coalition building, but also I think the things that we learned from the movement for Black Lives, which is some of the important lessons for me have been you don't have to be in a huge political formation to be organizing, right? You could be organizing in a signal chat of your 30 best friends or whatever. And that visibility that the street is a public space that needs taking, right, over and over. And it's something that we've always done, but I think at least in my lifetime, the way that the movement for Black Lives took the street was on a new level. And so I think that politics of kind of visibility, of claiming public space and I think that's why this whole poster shenanigan that's been happening has been so, I think that's why it's been so controversial and so, has created all this debate, because I think there is something deeply threatening to people about the public sphere being a sphere of dissonance. So I think, it's not a new thing, right? But I think, that's the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, I'll add, I feel like the community organizing world in New York is low-key small. I feel like we all know each other, or we know someone who's already doing the work, in the Bronx or in Queens. And it might not be very visible because it's maybe just in general, the media does not give enough attention to the smaller organizing groups that are out there. And there is also just collectives that are starting to grow and connect with one another. I love talking about one of our great partners, which is Speculative, who is a food collective group who are trying to work ways to address food insecurity in neighborhoods throughout New York City. They're a small and growing group. They work closely with Black Trans Liberation Kitchen. They work with the Washington Square Park Mutual Aid, and also work with one of our great partner orgs, Transnational, in distributing foods to trans women in Queens. And we are working collaboratively because we recognize that a lot of our membership are going to several of these different spaces, despite us being located in different parts of the city, to look for the resources that they are seeking. And we recognize that a lot of our communities are dealing with similar issues and are looking for similar resources. And so, because we are sort of seeking the same thing, we are tend to bumping into one another. And sometimes it's spaces that we don't even expect to find one another. It could be at these organizations, or it could be at community gardens, or it could be at other events like this. I will probably run into people that I know. I already see folks that I know that I didn't expect to be here. But that's just sort of how the community organizing road is in New York. I think I also just have the upper hand of being a born and raised New Yorker, and so just seeking community is something that I luckily have been grown into. But I also recognize that it can be difficult for other folks. And so that's why I also appreciate being part of CUDA, helping our members who came here by themselves, who don't have a community, trying to find the means of finding a space where they can find folks who have similar lived experiences as them, and figure out how can they establish a life here. We have a peer support program where members who have been living here for a few months or for a few years can help a newly arriving member to navigate the spaces. So that's just one way that I think you can like find other like spaces.
I don't have a lot to add to these great comments, but I'll say a couple of things. One is I worked as an organizer, mostly in AIDS politics, but some volunteer abolitionist projects and other things for 8 years or so. And so I thought a lot about strategy during that time, including trying to think about more radical or revolutionary strategy than the nonprofit organizing jobs that I had. And I have a lot to say about strategy in the city, but I increasingly, over the last few years, have become skeptical of the extent to which the mentality of organizers dominate how we think about radical politics. That organizers have to face a very particular set of questions about expanding their organizations, reproducing particular campaigns, sort of figuring out being a kind of outside force on some level, even if they have very strong bases, that their institutional affiliations, and that then are trying to assess how do you intervene. And that kind of corresponds to the idea of like, when people read our book and they say, what should we do? And I'm like, well, you probably know that a lot better than we do, right? That people fight where they are, and most importantly, when fighting really kicks off, when struggles really blow up, they blow up in totally unpredictable ways, using new tactics, new strategies, new organizations, and new ways of thinking. And organizers show up and are like, I remember the strategies we used in this previous wave of struggle, why don't you try that? And it's like, well, that was defeated. That's why they're trying something different. And like, organizers might have something to offer, but aren't always, can misjudge what that is, right? Can sort of come from a position of arrogance in not appreciating what is actually emerging in the struggles as they're unfolding. And that said, there is a mapping, right? A need for all of us, for whatever our roles are, to pay attention to how struggles actually unfold, historically and now, to look at, New York's very interesting because it's one of the very few cities that large numbers of working class people can move around in relatively easily, right? Where like teenagers, my kid goes to school on a 15-minute train ride away from me, right? That couldn't easily happen in a lot of places. And one thing, when I first moved to New York in 2004, I very quickly was working in this sort of constellation of AIDS and harm reduction groups. And I kept asking people about why so many AIDS groups were concentrated in Chelsea. It's like, why Chelsea, right? And I imagine most of you all know the answer to this. I didn't in 2004. Given that there are a lot of people with AIDS who don't live in Chelsea, right? And the answer, of course, is that large numbers of queer people in New York City, of all ages, want to leave their neighborhoods to go hang out with other people. Like deliberately go to the Village or Chelsea for social life, for services, for connection to other people. And of course, we need more AIDS infrastructure everywhere else, absolutely. But that the circulation of people, is mapped on the neighborhoods in a very complex and rich way that has decades of history behind it. And that's really central to trying to figure out, like, I sometimes, when I have a minute, work with this new formation, Queers for Liberated Palestine, and we did an action, and why did we do it in Chelsea, right? And the West Village. And so like these kind of geographies are very deeply embedded in rich, layered histories. And that's one of the amazing things about being in New York, the density and richness of these struggles as they unfold across geographies over decades.
I want to embroider a little on one thing that Amit just said and then add another thought or two. I very much agree with what you were just saying about the organizing mindset, but I think it's also important to say that that's because organizing has come to mean one incredibly limited version of organizing, which is the Saul Alinsky tradition, which I think is an incredible obstacle to getting any liberation work done of any kind. I won't go into a whole rant about that. You can grab me afterwards and hand me a glass of wine if you want it. But that idea of the organizer as the outside eye whose responsibility is to an organization rather than a movement, rather than a liberation project, is sort of the main thing I would say, don't go there. Like, that's what most 501c organizations are pushing. Don't go there. Don't work with them. Don't buy it. It's an obstacle. And similarly, and partly connectedly, the places that I see as having an overemphasis are the places that Alinsky organizing tradition says are important, which is the press and politicians, because it's an organizing tradition that is opposed to structural change. It says, find out who can give you what you want, and figure out how to persuade them. It doesn't say, figure out how to make what you need. It says, keep someone in power and try to persuade them to be nice to you. So what I think, and again, echoing what other folks have said, I think actual mapping of actual targets is one of the most important things, and I think the Palestine movement has been one of the places that I look to for how to do that incredibly well. I'm thinking in particular about the map that the Massachusetts Palestine Liberation Crew has made and kept updated over the past several years. That's just a brilliant work of mapping connections and networks and webs among the supporters of the continued occupation and colonization of Palestine. And that's a model that the Stop Cop City organizers in Atlanta have been looking to, partly because all of that organizing, I think, leans on animal liberation organizing that happened in many ways centered on Long Island in the 90s into the aughts with the Huntington Life Sciences campaign that was really groundbreaking in making those kinds of international networking maps and saying, you looking for something to do, no matter where you are, there's something near you. It's probably not in the neighborhood where you live, but it's within the reach of your hands. And that, to me, is the important thing. And connected to all of that, like the organizations that I see that I'm most inspired by are mostly the ones that aren't super visible beyond where they do their work. Folks like Centro Corona in Queens comes to mind because they have their hands in so many different kinds of things with a real deep grounding in their neighborhood.
I've got a couple other questions, but I actually want to get to hear from you all tonight. So we have ample time to be able to share some questions, some reflections on what you've heard. Sometimes in a public setting, there is actually a lot of opposition to someone sharing a thought, but we're really trying to tune in with each other strategically from across our respective kinds of work, our respective places in the city together. We have a microphone that's right over here, and want to ask if you may be willing to, I think this one right here is, it does have a cord. Maybe what we could do is, what would y'all say about maybe us being able to use one of these just in case? Thank you. So Oscar with SCCI is able to also move around if someone is like feeling like they want to remain in their seat. But the intention is to really connect with each other and to share different questions and thoughts that are coming to mind. And maybe what I'll do is, for just 2 minutes, I want to invite you all to turn to the person who's sitting beside you and share what's immediately at the top of mind right now. And then we'll come back together in a couple of minutes so that we can all connect as a group. How's that sound? All right, let's do it. Experiences that you have? What are some questions that you have? I see someone in the front, and then I also see someone in the back. Thank you both for getting us started. And then I see someone also right in here. So we've got the first three on deck.
Hi, everyone. I was curious specifically about, I was thinking about housing, and I was thinking about in a future where prisons and are abolished and the police are abolished, and this is, again, this like liberating kind of thing. What does housing look like in that world? And I'm wondering, I'm sure all of you guys have your own angles on that, that overlap, but I'm curious what you guys thought about that and how that really informs like where power is now with housing. Yeah.
And maybe to be able to hear from you all, we can take 2 questions or comments at a time. And Oscar, there was a compa that was just right up there. Oh, okay, no. Someone who's sitting on the second row right over here. Yeah.
Hi. Something that immediately came to the forefront of my mind. Hi, my name is Iktisam. Test names are mine. That's not good, maybe, but something that came to the forefront of my mind is how all of these current genocides that are happening and have been ongoing are interlinked by the same set of oppressors and ruling class of people who are holding the power. And we certainly have more power that we're not able to organize and structure yet. And so something that I'm thinking of right now is how can we, as Anna put it, how can we approach our issues in a way that is not divvying up the energy so that we are expending time over here, but then it's also these people who need help, and it's also these people who need help. How can we collectively, and I think this is coming very specifically from a Black, feminist, intersectional praxis of thought, how can we approach our liberation movements from an angle of, that intersection, where we are holding everyone. So when I think about in action, I'm thinking like shut down New York. Just shut it down. Shut it down because ultimately we are the ones who are holding the power. We keep working. We keep providing services and I understand a lot of people are responsible for loved ones and are responsible for children and elderly, and you are working within coalitions where there are needs, right? And so if your service stops, so what is it to reclaim our power and to just shut everything down so that we can take care of one another? To quote Joy James, what does that maroonage within our society and community, what could that look like? Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm hearing questions about housing and the specific focus on housing and a liberatory horizon with that. Also thinking about this question of extending that, how to coalesce our power, shutting things down, striking, practicing marronage. So 2 things to get us started. I'm curious what comes to mind for y'all.
I could say one thing partly on the second, towards the second question, is how I see that approach coming into the abolition spaces where I spend my time as an organizer and agitator mostly these days, which is doing our best to not talk about things in isolation ever. So we had in Brower Park in my neighborhood an abolition block party this summer, and the first thing you saw as you approached it up Kingston Avenue was a giant banner that said Free Palestine. We didn't plan for that to be there. The crew who organized that, one of the participants brought it because they knew that it was going to be a space that would want that said alongside the banners that said Free Them All, alongside the banners that talked specifically from other struggles that are interwoven and connected in one way or another. And I see that kind of thing, even where it's mostly a sort of an announcement of the multidirectionalness of the space, to be a sort of an echo backward from that larger scale vision of what a transformative action can look like.
I actually think the two questions are really interrelated, and I totally agree with what you said, but I also think, so I think part of it is we have to start thinking about all of the resources, the collective macro level resources of our community, of our globe, as collective resources, right? To say, like, for example, the idea that we have unhoused people when actually in almost every major American city we have a housing surplus. We have all these empty apartments, right? So like what happens when we start thinking about all of the apartments in New York City as our collective inheritance, as a society, as a people, right? Rejecting the idea that anyone could just decide that they own hundreds of housing units, right? And in a society in which everything is produced interdependently, right? So I think those are kind of similar things, right? It's actually what happens if we think of the resources of the entire globe, all of the food in the world as collective, all of the technology of the world as a collective inheritance of humankind, because it's only through an interdependent society that any of that was achievable, that you could build a high rise, that you could send someone to the moon, that you could feed masses of people, right, from this agriculture. That's all the collective wealth of humanity, and so we have to think of it as collective wealth that we, in a free society, in a liberated society, would get to divvy up based on need. And so what is that, I think it starts there, right? In terms of the kind of more micro level, in our novel, we imagine housing is exactly that, right? We, all of us, own all of the housing in New York, and as a collective, there isn't no single person who owns it. And so we take what we need. People live in the spaces that they need. There are some people who really are particular, and need to kind of live in their own little space, but they're taken care of. They have a canteen, whatever, right? There are people who want to live in a giant house with like 20 of their best friends, and that's great because we have giant houses and we have small apartments, right? And we have everything we need, right? And so that's the vision, I think, but you can't get there without the broader vision.
These are like two questions I think often about, especially with my membership. A question that like my colleague Eman, who's also the coordinator of community organizing, something that we're always discussing is how do we help our members show up to actions? How do we help our members lead these coalitions and campaigns? Because something that we see just happen throughout the years is less and less of our members are engaging with community organizing. And not so much because they don't want to, it's because they're not able to. And so it's something that we're always like thinking and seeing is who is able to organize, who is able to engage with the community, because also community organizing is labor work, and some people can't just give their labor work for free. And so trying to see what is stopping our members from coming to these spaces, from being able to be these leaders that they have the ability to do. Because they have so many great ideas. They are helping us restructure our organization as we're going through all these changes. And as much as they would love to be more involved, they just don't have the time or the capacity to do so. And also looking in different ways of how does showing up look like? Because there are a lot of our members who have disabilities or aren't able to physically appear. And so what are other means of showing up can look like? And yeah, in housing, I love looking at community land trusts and seeing how different communities sort of organize and envision what housing looks like to them. Because like you were just saying, like housing, like people want to envision their future houses differently. And to say like we're just going to apply one housing model to all is kind of really hard to do because everyone wants to live differently. And so seeing how a community can self-govern and self-decide their own autonomy is something that I tend to look more towards.
I certainly think it's helpful for me to think about totality, to think about that all these various forms of oppression are interconnected into a unified system that's self-reproducing, that entails all of us. And I usually call that racial capitalism in my work. I think there are other terms, but I politically came of age in an era in the 90s when it was really not popular to talk about totality in a meaningful sense. And to sort of riff on two of the comments, so I think organizers today are really quite militants. Radicals today are really quite oriented to thinking around multi-issue politics in a much richer way than before, and I would attribute that overwhelmingly to Black Lives Matter and the Black rebellions of the last few years. Hands down, the biggest trans movement of my lifetime is the movement for Black Lives Matter at the George Floyd rebellion, right? The number of young Black trans people who came up in that movement as leaders was absolutely incredible and really breathtaking to see. And the way that that movement really managed to pull together issues in a way that's very deeply tied up with how anti-Blackness is about capitalism, it is about housing, it is about gender, it is about sexuality, it is about state violence, right? All these things are so deeply tied up with anti-Blackness in a way that I think the Black liberation movement historically in the United States plays a kind of relatively unique and extraordinary role in holding over the last 200 years. In thinking about and enabling us to think about that totality. But the flip side to the totality is what Eman was saying, which is we are actually interconnected with everyone else, right? Like just the clothes on our body link us to a global, multiracial working class of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, that, you know, we all the time, through impersonal market transactions and our jobs, are woven into a vast interdependent fabric of a community, the community of capital, the community that reigns over our lives and involves all of us and links us all together. And that totality, like, is not what we think of as our community most of the time. It's not how we're able to organize most of the time. Most of the time we're organizing in our free time, right? Like, which we don't have much of. But meanwhile, we are spending our lives reproducing racial capitalism interdependent with millions and millions and millions of other people. And the revolutionary task, which no one knows how to do right now, is to try to figure out how to pivot movements so that it's not just about something people do in free time, but actually about seizing and remaking that totality, seizing and remaking the vast interdependent relationships that actually tie us all together in ways that are impersonal and under the reign of capital. And that's worth trying to imagine and worth trying to talk about.
Right on. So we're going to kick it back to you all. What's coming to mind? We've got questions, we've got comments. I see you. Go ahead.
Peace, everybody. My name is Key William. Always a blessing in a space with anybody with similar ideas. ME, long time
It's
homie,
good to
but
see
good
you.
to see you across the space in the room. We have 2 questions. We're gonna pocket it together. This little group right here. Our first question really is to, I guess, the curators of the Shaping of the City space, which is practitioners and organizers, etc., folks who have been in the work in the movement for over a decade. The reason why organizers, activists, etc., do not map our work, do not publicly archive our work is because of surveillance state, because of COINTELPRO, because of etc., etc. I mean, a lot for some reason, but that's where I'm at right now. So my question is, how are you guys thinking about the safety of resistance work if you're actually going to be mapping it, documenting it? How is that going to be information that is secure, right, for organizers, especially in this particular time that we live in, with Cop City, with 4 new jails, with council members in both Atlanta and Baltimore enforcing mask bans, which is not just a public health risk, but also surveillance risk, etc. So my first question is, in this documentation project, how are you thinking about safety and security for organizers in mapping resistance? My second question is to the authors, as a historical nerd and somebody who's looking at rebellions, specifically in New York City, from the first rebellion in 1712 onward to modernity. How did you guys come up with that particular date? How did you guys come up with 2052 to 2072? What was the math?
We had to
in that?
imagine we were still alive to do this. We're like, how long can we stretch this thing?
I'm curious, holding this question of, is mapping also making people susceptible to state repression, if I heard this piece? And also the question of how far, like, our finite living bodies in the room, how far can we look ahead in envisioning a future liberatory movement? Want to share a lot of gratitude for you asking these questions. I'm curious, just to make sure that we're able to hear from folks in the room, if there's maybe one more comment or question that someone wants to throw in before we kick it back to people here. I see one person over here. Y'all are all kinds of shy tonight, but there's all kinds of brilliance in the room. I see you. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Can people hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Kind of going off of what Ibtisam shared before, and then the beautiful answers that came. Yeah, I was thinking about like strategy and this idea of like how to coalesce our power, and I think in terms of what Rosa shared earlier of like the press and politicians being a particular area where often one particular kind of organizing focuses energy, I feel like there's a great need to be careful about how we expend our energy and release it versus how we are able to recycle it and regenerate it in unpredictable ways. And I think like already we've talked a lot about tools for reconfiguration tonight, so like literature and zine making and community meetings being some tools. And yeah, I guess I'm curious if there are more tools for reconfiguration or energy generating ways to stay unpredictable that come to mind for you all. And particularly, I was thinking about the part of Everything for Everyone about like the multi-scalar technology in the dance scene, and in my conversation, in the sidebar conversation, we discussed technology a bit, and so I just was thinking about that in tandem of like, in part of reclaiming the totality or re-enchanting the totality, re-enchanting the commons, like you were talking about, is also about like taking those networks of connectivity and not making them premise on capitalism. So those are some thoughts and some questions.
I'll say a few words about dates. So the very first chapter of this I wrote on my own, and it was the Caleb Huan chapter, and it appeared in the now defunct online magazine. And I wrote it after I had a job with the New York Public Library organizing events for the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion that came out of my work with the New York City Trans Oral History Project. And we did some good events, a few. So it was the 50th anniversary, and so I wrote this interview with the young trans girl at the 100th anniversary of 2069. So that was the sort of starting point of it. Thinking about what it means to be looking back 50 years, right? We're seeing a lot of 50th anniversaries because of the importance of the rebellions in the late 60s and early 70s. And we also wanted to start the timeline a little ways out so our book wouldn't become immediately dated. So things really kick off in the 2030s. And then in the 40s, it's like massive catastrophe, massive rebellions. And then 2050s, it finally reaches New York, and it takes, a decade to unfold. And as Eman put it, we had to still be alive. So it's sort of coming up with a timeline to imagine that. And all of this, right, it's like a thought activity. So I was somewhat influenced by this wacky essay by a British group called Angry Workers, where they're like, what if, revolutionary communist forces, and by that they mean all workers, took control of the United Kingdom? Suddenly, right, they won. Like, what industries would we immediately have to destroy? What industries would we have to retool? And what industries would we have to massively expand? Like, let's write it out over, 50 pages. Like, just sort of like, do some research, crunch some numbers, be like, okay, what happens to all the finance people? What do we do with them? Like, we can put them to work planning food distribution or whatever. And actually they have a one paragraph where they're like, units of 50 to 200 people could be really effective form of social reproduction. And I'm like, yes, they would be. Let me write 2 books on that. And I think those kind of thought activities work if you need to allow yourself to move beyond the pragmatic, right? Who knows how they would come to power in the UK? I mean, through massive events. But 2, with a plausible dimension to it, where it's like, if we won, how would we do it? And working back from there, right? Trying to imagine that both the world historical events that would need to be in place and the kind of movements that would need to be in place. And using that as a way of trying to think about strategy that's much bigger than what can I accomplish in this immediate moment, which is often how we talk about strategy. So that informs a little bit of how I think about the question of dates.
Yeah, to add on to the surveillance question, that is something that, another question I think often about, with my members, CBP like to say that they solved or created a new solution to the overflowing of detention centers by having the CBP One app, where folks at the border can easily sign in and get across the border, but not knowing that the app is doing some app tracking. They're selling the information that is being inputted into these apps, and then we're now starting to see repercussions from it. And because it is a fairly new thing, we don't know completely what they're doing with all this data that they're collecting and what they're going to be doing with it. There's also the proposal of using ankle monitors instead of having folks in these facilities which is just another form of criminalization. And that's what I often think about when I think about surveillance. It's just the surveillance state trying to find more means to just criminalize the folks that they want to criminalize. And it's really difficult for a lot of folks, especially like if you're an immigrant, where you have to fit in, you feel forced to fit into like the perfect immigrant model. I don't know exactly the answer, but just constantly being aware and thinking of how are these quote-unquote new solutions or proposals going to be affected in the long run. How to go about it with some hesitancy, because then it brings up more questions and it brings up possible repercussions that come from it. So yeah.
Just to say one thing, I also really adored the thread of the dance floor in Everything for Everyone, partly because my experience on the dance floor, like a lot of people's, has been of it as a place where extremely old and extremely new technology bang into each other and get messed around with by people based on their desire in a way that doesn't happen in a lot of other spaces. And to me, I'm a cultural worker. Mostly I work in very old forms, very old performance forms, stuff like the scene series that takes place on paper, public events like the ones we've been doing with the scenes that have a ritual component to them. But to me, it's the interplay of those with the either most newly developed or most newly perverted technologies. That's where the excitement is. I realized I should have said a geography that I would love it if some militants would start thinking about is the massive dirt bike crews that, at least in Brooklyn, have really become an entire part of the landscape for the warm part of the year, in a way that just wasn't true 10 years ago, let alone 20, let alone 30, because it's one of those spaces.
Just gonna share just a quick paragraph from that chapter on the barges. O'Brien asks, you said there were 2 replacements for the internet, and Tanya John says, the other innovation was the dance barges. I don't honestly know how they pulled it off, but I knew a lot of kids coming in who had spent months on the barges in West Africa, the southern and eastern Mediterranean, the Jakarta circuit I described before, and another along the coast of China. It was this whole global world, and our scene in the Bronx was very tied up with it. So when the internet went down, they built these huge servers on the barges and set up these hacked satellite uplinks and transmitters to all the port cities. It was patchwork and broke all the time, but it managed to reestablish international communications. The dance kids would show up in new cities with link protocols on their Augie chips and get a city partially back online. Years later, I think in 2055, the NYPD tried again to shut down the internet in the city. This time, everyone got hooked up to the meshes, and it became the beginning of the nets we all use now. But originally, it was dance kids and vets who made it happen. I used to say dancers were the neural links of the new world.
So I'd also like to share a few thoughts with regard to mapping and surveillance. For me, we have so many just vast reservoirs of lessons from our social movements, not just in New York, not just in the US, but around the world, across generations and generations and generations. And a lot of the challenge is that people feel like they're starting from square one in a moment of like collective uprising. Or maybe even thinking about what were we doing 10 years ago? Or let's talk with some older heads who were doing this 50 years ago. But this is a very long process of liberation. that also has these moments of leaps. And so I think, for people in the room who are drawn to the kind of inherited energies that can occur on the page, archiving is a part of liberation. And I feel like there's something that you're pointing to that's a real contradiction there, is that when we try to document our stories, when we try to, leave some breadcrumbs for future generations who are doing this work as well, this can also be very much so laying ourselves bare for the scrutiny of the state, making it more easy for them to repress us, being able to show the connections between one group and another, between one person and another. I feel like there are moments, though, when, to use a phrase, like the cat gets out of the bag, right? And it's not just one cat, it's hundreds of thousands of cats. Or in 2020, it's anywhere from 15 to 26 million cats who were out on the streets in 500 towns and cities across the country. In moments of collective uprising for Gaza, right, it's millions of people, millions of cats, sorry, millions of cats who are all out of the bag. And then so what occurs then is, are we able to out-mobilize the state trying to repress us? And so I feel like, for us not to lose that, not to lose the reaching towards each other and showing the clarity of the strategizing that we're doing, even as we're taking very, very seriously that the state, corporations, our bosses, our employers, the police, that they're all really trying to shut things down as quickly as possible. I think there are ways that people, when they're dedicating themselves to be able to organize more effectively, and taking in mind like a lot of the words of caution to not do this kind of rote kind of organizing, there needs to be an above ground and underground dimension to it. I think there needs to be a way that people can keep secrets really well. Talked about the power of the dance floor, right? The dance floor or the crowded bar is a really great place to tell a secret, right? There's also ways that when we're on Signal or WhatsApp chats, like our friend, Turtle or Taco, right, is like responding to us. It's like, okay, no, but actually some of the most important conversations, people do need to be in the room together. So, thank you all for hearing our invitation to gather tonight. But I'm hoping also, just in final, that we think about this archiving question in this exact moment, because it's a very different situation for us now, archiving 21st century movements, than it was for people who were documenting through flyers, through mimeographs, through different kinds of materials that were analog, that were these kinds of physical things that we could hold. And so an ongoing question that I have for us is, what happens when we're looking ahead 10, 20, 30 years from now, and all of the movement work that we were doing on Instagram and on Twitter is not accessible? The Word docs and PDF attachments that we were using to try to document our stuff has received bit rot, so we can't open the attachment anymore. So a question about looking into the future, how to create a kind of historical memory that future generations can inherit, as things are also very fleeting and very digital in this present moment. So just really grateful for your question, and I'm hoping that it's something that we can keep thinking about, including folks here who are affiliated with Shape of Cities to Come, to take really seriously that mapping is also a way of producing vulnerability. So yeah, but we have a little bit more time. Maybe what we can do is get a few more questions, comments, and then we'll kick it to folks. We have some wine in the back, so we've got some zines as well. I see you if you want to share some thoughts. Okay, thanks, Will Scott.
Thank you all. My question is about, Emmy, you said that you and Eman's book is not a blueprint, but you've also very clearly done a lot of deep research, about the past. And I'm wondering, I often come up against this issue, in different kind of struggle, where people do have do struggle to break their imaginations open. And so I'm wondering what kinds of practical methods any of you might have in terms of how to learn from the past and transform that into something that could become yeah, what enabled you to do that speculative work, kind of methodologically?
Right on. So the method of speculative work. And maybe getting to hear from one. I see you. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful conversation. My name is Fernanda, and I was wondering why you chose the oral history form, both as a literary form, but also as a way of relating in the future and a way of documenting history in the future.
So thinking about speculative methods for movement work and the oral history form in particular. I'm curious what comes to mind. And any final thoughts? Get to hear from everyone.
Yeah, in terms of learning from the past, I think that when you dig far enough, right, you realize how malleable. So going back to the earlier in the conversation, we were talking about the hold that capitalism, the liberal order, all of these things has on our imagination. I think that for me, it's about looking into the past for where these things emerge, right? So if you think about the nuclear family, right, which is kind of billed to us as this like natural form, it has actually an incredibly short history and a fraught one, even in those few decades that it's existed, right? But also even further back, I'm actually reading this book right now, which I don't totally agree with the author's politics, but it's fascinating. It's called Against the Grain, and it basically makes an argument against the idea. So we're all taught, you're taught this in probably high school or college, that everything, basically human prosperity, mass prosperity begins with the state, and the state begins with agriculture. He sort of is making the argument that actually there was mass prosperity before and outside the state, and even outside of agricultural societies. So it's a sort of like, again, rethinking, like, does the state have to be the way we live? Well, it hasn't been always the way we live. And so, imagining past that, I think becomes, and then I think also reading sci-fi, because it is really imagining different material conditions, and then being very careful about which sci-fi is actually just now, but even more fascist, which happens a lot. So I would say that those have been really important things for me, like reading kind of long or deep history. And I think thinking about, and then I think the third kind of intervention is social movements. So in moments of crisis and in moments of social movements, we see people function outside of those systems, right? When people get together and say, we're gonna actually build a kitchen in this square and no one's gonna have to pay for food, right? And we're gonna basically reorganize ourselves. We're already seeing that alternative social form take place on a smaller scale. And we see it over and over. And I think it's interesting that in almost every moment of crisis and almost every social movement, we see this organically pop up over and over and over, even though we are told our whole lives that if left to our own devices, we would all destroy each other. But lo and behold, in almost every disaster situation, the first thing we do is take care of each other, and we don't do it with money. So I think, I think those are the three spaces, I think, that have, at least for me, provided imaginative possibilities. And I'll let Michelle add to that and maybe answer the oral history.
Sure. So as far as oral histories, both Eman and I are oral historians. I coordinated the New York City Trans Oral History Project for 3 years, and right now I work as a psychoanalyst in formation, and there's a lot of similarities in sitting and listening to people all day. And Eman does interviews, life course interviews with Muslim Americans about entering and leaving religious community and gender and lots of other things. So we're both very used to the interview form. We find it very easy. But, and it really helped us get around some of the thornier problems in, I think, contemporary literature that are very fraught, and that's a more complicated question. And one thing that I really liked in writing this book is we can move between people recounting world historical events, massive events involving hundreds of millions of people, their personal life trajectory, and their personal psychic life being revealed in how they speak, right? In the rhythms of their speech and their thought. And then the sort of multiple cultural and social influences in how they think. And all of that you can hold together very easily in like a single paragraph of text. That the interviews can sort of move between very personal and very political registers quite seamlessly in a way that is much closer to how I experience politics. And the Oral History Forum serves that well. As far as the question about sort of how to unlock thinking about the future, I guess, I think Eman's answer around actually looking at what actually happens in movements is very powerful. That is really central to my family abolition book, right? Family abolition has a dimension for thinking about the overcoming of class society, but through the pivot, the link to the present is not primarily in like what we call communes or chosen family or other things. The link to the present is when large numbers of working class people are in rebellion against state or the capital, how do they socially reproduce themselves? And it is not the nuclear family. The nuclear families work in a counter-revolutionary force, a counter-insurgency force. And that, you know, in some rebellions, all members of a nuclear family might join in and find themselves eating with other people, caring for other people, sleeping alongside other people, you know, in protest camps and barricades and riots and guerrilla wars, and relating to each other as comrades. And the way that that transforms what's possible. And so that's really, I opened the family abolition book talking about the Oaxaca Commune in 2006 and how social reproduction happened on the barricades by indigenous women, extending the kind of labor that they often did in the home, becoming means of reproducing the rebellion. And I also add that it's a pedagogical question that everyone faces in movements. How do we think together about what we're doing and in ways that link it to other issues in bigger ways? And in that sense, certainly everyone up here, and probably most people, if not everyone in this room, would have something to say about that. That this is a question that we all grapple with in different kinds of ways. And you don't need to have written a science fiction novel to give it real thought.
I'm trying to think what's sort of interesting or useful to say about speculative method with the City of Abolished Prisons project. And I feel like a piece of it is attention to a particular kind of attention to texture and messiness. That's part of why I really resonated with what Eman's saying. A lot of what I read is history, and a lot of what I read is science fiction. And what I want in both is the stuff that doesn't quite work, the details that pop out when you're walking down Ashland Street and you notice that suddenly there's a chunk of stone wall and this giant smokestack that don't seem to have much of anything to do with the rest of Brooklyn Hospital Center that's right there. And it's because they were part of the Raymond Street Jail that was closed in 1963, but its first incarnation was built in the 1830s. And a lot of what that was in the process that me and Annabelle worked with in making these zines was looking for those kinds of physical traces because they're the undigested bits. And And those are where the resistance of the material to what's trying to be done to it is easiest to see in the cities, where that resistance is architectural in one way or another. It took a really long time for buildings to get built where the Crow Hill Penitentiary building was. The empty parts of the lot got built up real quick. And that may or may not have been what made that land attractive to the imaginers of the Catholic school that was there before Medgar Evers College, and so on and so on. So to me, a lot of the speculative, the methodology of speculation is what's the stuff that remains, what's the stuff that doesn't get worked in. And that means doing a lot of collaborating with dead people, because they're there. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just like thinking and everything that everyone has mentioned is really great. Yeah, speculative thinking is something that we also trying to encourage our members to do. Like I've stated before, like it's sort of difficult to look for, imagine a future beyond what you're, beyond like all the oppressive factors that are intersecting in your daily life. A lot of our members are in the shelter system, so a lot of them are having to figure out where they're gonna, which shelter they're gonna stay at tonight. What are they gonna eat? Because a lot of these shelters, they don't allow food in these places. So figuring out where they're gonna get a meal. And if they get produce or any sorts of groceries, how are they gonna find a place to cook it? Then a lot of them, as I mentioned, have HIV. So getting the resources that they need for their medical, for their health issues. And just all these other things. And so it's hard for them to imagine or think of a future where these oppressive factors aren't in effect in their daily lives. And there's often this notion that, oh, it's just been like this forever, or it's been like this for so long. But then looking into the history is that, no, it has not been. And there are communities, even in their country of origin, like places that they have escaped, have been able to find means of going beyond these oppressive factors. Like Eman mentioned with the York Commune, there are a lot of other communities in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, in Latin America, in African countries who have been able to do it. But it's just not, like the information isn't as easily accessible. And so looking into the histories and sharing this information with folks, you start to then imagine what would that look like in my life. And so that's something that we try to do with our programs. We try to go over a bit of history of how these issues came about. Because also another thing that tends to occur is the constant competition. Because a lot of the resources that they're looking for, there's a very, it's very little. Like thinking about, we're setting up a food distribution program, but we can only have a certain amount of boxes of produce to give out. And then figuring out how to distribute these produces. Because we're not also going to give just everyone the same amount of produce, because some people, you know, some of them don't even know how to cook certain produce that we're trying to give them. A lot of them are coming from very different regions where the produce that we have here locally aren't the same from their country of origins. So then figuring out how can we distribute it effectively, equitably, how can we teach our members how to cook this new produce. Oh, sorry. No, you're good. It's good to be mindful of time. And so there's a lot of things to think about when trying to address the lack of resources that folks have. And when there's so many factors to think about, it can be very easy to like forget about where are we going, how did we get here? And so having that sort of structure of like, this is how we got here, and this is how we can start envisioning the future beyond all these factors.
Right on. So I want to invite you all again. Gratitude for sticking to the end here. Please join me in saying thank you, gracias, again to Eman, Envy, Rosa, and Van. Continues to roll along. Really want to invite you to come along with us to continue to be reaching towards each other and reaching to SCCI as we're doing the study, play, and act work with each other. So definitely encourage y'all to check out shapeofcitiestocome.org. We're also on Instagram, Shape of Cities to Come. There's going to be more public dialogues like this. And for now, we've got a little bit of time to kick it in here. There's some drinks in the back. Please say hello to the person who's sitting beside you. Feel free to stick around for a little bit. There's also zines in the back as well that Rosa has from the City of Abolished Prisons project. And immense gratitude again to y'all for coming.